everyone, Alexa Dunn here, and today I am going to be talking about endings. I've already made videos on book beginnings and the muddled middle, and finally I am talking about the dreaded, at least by me, ending. I've hesitated in making this video up to this point because I always try to have some reasonable confidence in myself in whatever craft topic I'm discussing, which is why there are certain topics I have not covered, because I don't want to just regurgitate information at you that I found on the internet. I hope to have some kind of foundational experience in anything I talk about, and I find endings very tricky. I've now written 5 books, 2 of which are already published, a 3rd coming out, and I'm working on my 6th, and I don't know if I've yet nailed one of my endings. I'm very hopeful for my next book coming out next year at the Ivies. I worked hard on the ending. I rewrote it a few times, but in many reviews of my work, there's been very mixed opinions about how my endings are. So meaning I'm coming at you with the self-reflection and knowledge that endings might not be my strong suit, but that I've been very committed to trying to learn how to be better at them. I've been analyzing the books I'm reading, and thus I offer this guide to writing effective endings with a healthy disclaimer that I'm not an expert, but I am here to certainly bring you along with some of my own journey of figuring out how the heck to nail your ending. Now that that's out of the way, well, endings are very important, aren't they? I certainly feel as a reader that a ending that doesn't quite land, or worse, a bad ending, can ruin a book for me. At best, I'm gonna knock a star off, but when it's really, really bad, it can just ruin the entire book for me. And a book can go from a 5-star to a 3-star or lower. And even beyond the books on the shelf, prior to that stage, endings are particularly critical when it comes to querying and then selling your book. Because in the world of agents and everyone writing books, and in the world of editors, and like there's plenty of books to acquire, but only so many publication slots, many publishers might see ending, a bad ending, as something that's just not worth their bandwidth to work on. There's this high pressure and expectation placed on authors to nail their endings. I know it's stressful. And particularly on the query side, a phenomenon that's very common is writers who polish their beginning over and over again, and their beginning gets really, really good, but then it all kind of falls apart towards the back half of the book, and you don't want that to happen. So I'm going to talk about common pitfalls for bad or ineffective endings, and then talk about some strategies for fixing it and getting better at endings. Some of them are just options, because also ultimately endings are very subjective. There can be an ending that one reader really, really loves and another reader hates it. So it's definitely a tricky area to navigate. I'm also focusing on the literal ending of the book, the stuff that's coming after your climax, rather than the 3rd act on its own. Act 3 almost deserves its own video. With beginnings and middles, I really focused on those entire acts, but something about endings, it's really not about Act 3. I mean, Act 3 certainly is important. It's the ending, whatever those last few chapters are, that make all the difference. So that is what I am focusing on. So first, some very common pitfalls with endings. These are many traps that writers will fall into when it comes to their endings. The first one is the abrupt ending, where you have your climax, your finale, and then the book just ends. What those endings tend to lack is meaningful emotional resolution. In some of my craft videos, I've always talked about the need for a denouement, something I feel is missing from the beat sheet. And what this is to me is the breathing moment after the climax to let the reader kind of release their breath and kind of feel emotionally wrapped up with the book's ending. So an abrupt ending fails to do this. It's just like, we solved it, bye. It's especially bad when a reader finishes the book and can't believe it's the ending and they go back to make sure that they didn't make a mistake. I've had that happen on thrillers, and those will literally be like, we caught the killer, the end, and those really frustrate me. So the second pitfall that's really common is what I'm gonna call the Lord of the Rings never-ending ending, and I mean the famous joke about the movie where it had like 9 endings / epilogues and they just stacked one after the other. You can't go too far in terms of emotional and character resolution. You can have too many dragging chapters checking in on every single character and person. So it's definitely a matter of being very efficient with kind of the scope of your ending. You don't want to drag on too long past the climax. And then a pitfall that I'm calling the bog standard rushed ending. This differs from the abrupt ending in that the abrupt ending is literally the climax happens by. The bog standard rushed ending is more like there is an ending, but it's just very, very short. It feels a little bit too pat. It feels a little bit too easy to the readers. Like, sure, you answer their questions, but like something's missing. I'll say that the bog standard rushed ending is probably the most subjective because, as I mentioned, the ending exists and you do what you need to do in the ending, but for some readers, it's just going to feel rushed to them. It's difficult to say what the perfect length of an ending is because I don't think you can say that. It's different for every story and it's gonna land differently with every reader. So I know you're like, that's frustrating. It kind of sounds like I can't win. Kind of, except you can refine your skills to get better at ending, she says, having been working on this for years and years and years and still not confident I've gotten there, but darn it, I try. So I want to talk about some options you have for ending. So this is even beyond the pitfalls. If you're a writer who's stuck on what your ending should be, I'm gonna go through what are some kind of common types of endings. So probably the most common / popular one is what I call returning to the status quo. This kind of harkens back to the beat sheet. In beat sheets, you have your opening image. And beat sheets recommend you end with a closing image, and they're usually mirror images of each other. Thus, there's some aspect of returning to the status quo of the beginning that you are going to explore in this kind of ending. It's going to feel full circle because it is a return to the same kind of images and settings and ideas of the very beginning. The difference is, of course, that your character has gone on a journey and there's been growth and change, and so it's kind of, it feels satisfying because it's the return to the familiar but with change. So, for example, let's say your story is set at school and you open with lunch in the cafeteria. The mirror image of this, the return to the status quo, would be that you end the book also in the cafeteria, but the conversations the characters are having are different. The interactions feel different. The main character has experienced something and learned something. It's also really common in movies, by the way. I will say mirror images don't always work for me as well in books, but that's a whole other thing about my quibbles with the beat sheet. Or let's say your book starts at the train station, end at the train station. If it starts in a scene with the character's best friend, you end in a scene with the character's best friend. You want to think about thematically the dramatic contrast you can have of returning back to the status quo and yet everything has changed. That's basically the idea of it. The second very common ending type is what I call the Hollywood happy ending. This is where you end with a wedding or a party or, you know, everyone's happily ever after at the end. This is going to work particularly well in certain genres. It's also a very Hollywood thing, again, literally. But essentially, it's different from Return to the Status Quo because your character has achieved or arrived at a thing, a place that is like the big culmination goal, but it's either different from what they expected it to be because they should be a different person by now, or it's exactly what they wanted and it's still a full circle feeling, but you're not going back to their life the way it was, you're putting them in the arrival of the place that they wanted to be, whatever that means. The third common in quotes type of ending, this one you have to be very, very careful with, but it's a type that everyone knows, and that is the cliffhanger ending. This is where you think that you're putting a character in status quo, you think that you're giving them a happy ending, and then you pull the rug out from under the reader at the very last minute. You have some kind of revelation or twist that leaves things open-ended. Cliffhanger endings are very, very dangerous. If you go with a cliffhanger ending, especially in a standalone, this can be super polarizing for readers because essentially you've promised them resolution and then you've yanked it away at the last minute. And then when it comes to series, Very common tactic with series, obviously. This is to get them very excited for your next installment, and you can hit the ground running in that next installment with something big and exciting. But you should be positive you're gonna get another book, first of all, and even when you do series, some readers just hate cliffhanger endings, so I would be careful with this one. And then there are epilogues. This is a very common tactic, especially in genre fiction, things like science fiction and fantasy, though you see it in kind of lit fic as well. If a book has a prologue, it feels very natural to then have an epilogue. An epilogue is a jump forward in time or a jump forward to something that's gonna feel very different from the rest of the book. It's a resolution of everything in the same way that any ending should give a resolution of everything, but epilogues are a bit more pat. They're more likely to feel like narration, where it's like, and then we skipped ahead, but don't worry, I, the narrator, even if it's the main character, I'm gonna tell you how everything worked out. It's a very efficient way to explain everything that either went on or has happened since, to leave the reader satisfied, but you're doing it very quickly and effectively. It's also okay to slightly change your tone in an epilogue. So an epilogue can work very, very well when you have a very dramatic, exciting climax, and it's tough to figure out what that next scene is in an ending that would represent a total tonal shift. Like, you have to conclude your book in some way and wrap everything up, but you don't quite know how. Sometimes an epilogue can work, or it can even be a time jump, even if you don't call it an epilogue, but think of the style of an epilogue for approaching a final chapter. I will confess, this is a style that I have used, and this is my caution about epilogue style endings. A lot of people don't like them. It totally depends on the reader. They're very subjective, and they can fall into that bog standard rushed ending, the ones that feel a little bit too pat. They technically wrap everything up, but some readers just don't like them. So that's the warning I do want to offer. But that said, I personally as a reader love a nicely applied epilogue. Of course, I don't like a non-nicely applied epilogue. Epilogue can feel like they come out of nowhere in some ways in terms of kind of the patness and happiness of the tone. So that's kind of the warning I would give. Now I'm going to go over some key ingredients of an ending, what I consider key ingredients of an ending, no matter how you execute it. The function of an ending. You want to let your reader breathe, reflect, and settle after all of the exciting events of your book. It's the place to address unanswered questions, sometimes to explain things, but be very careful of kind of the info dumpy, well, you know, Bob, this will happen in mysteries and thrillers a lot. It's the place for final moments of character resolution, especially side characters. It's the moment to have the friends have that cathartic conversation and make up, if maybe they were fighting, but it wasn't the main thrust of the novel. It could even be the moment that something that wasn't very clear to the character earlier on suddenly becomes crystal clear, and remember that they've changed. Now they see it with brand new eyes. You want to reflect and demonstrate character growth, also reflect on the theme. I know that sounds very lofty, and I don't really like talking about it in concrete terms. I always feel so like hoity-toity talking about the theme of your book. But regardless, a well-designed and executed ending definitely should reflect the theme of the book and kind of what you're trying to say. And that's the thing about endings. One tiny change changes what you're trying to say or what readers will take away from the book. And that's the thing, the ending is like that final cap on the whole book. It is the literal last image that your reader is going to have, and so you do need to think about what it is going to say. You also want to think about who readers might want to see one more time. Again, resolution. It really is about resolution. It's that one last chance. If you have really important characters earlier in the book and they're not directly involved in the climax and then they don't show up in the ending, this can feel very jarring to a reader because it's like they just disappeared. Endings are that ideal opportunity to bring things full circle and wrap everything up. Though, like I said, some books do go with kind of the variation of the cliffhanger ending where they do some kind of twist and they leave you on a question. And so it can be a choice to have an ending that does kind of jar the reader a bit, and it's usually a reflection of whatever you want to leave the reader with. It's like not never do that, but you want to be thoughtful about that if that is the kind of ending you're going for. Those are most often darker endings. They're meant to be unsettling. You don't want to have an unsettling ending if that wasn't actually your intention, and vice versa. So how do you fix an ending if you think your ending is broken? And this is where it honestly gets tricky, and all I can tell you is what I have done for better or for worse, and workshopping is the only way because endings are so subjective. I mean, every part of a book in many ways is subjective, but I think endings are almost more than in any other part of the book because every reader has their own emotional experience of reading a book, and they're going to bring their own kind of thoughts, feelings, and expectations to it. In workshopping, so this should be critique partners when you're further along, it is your agent or your editor, but the thing is, someone who's read your book over and over again, including you, can get very clouded about the effectiveness of an ending and what an ending is really doing, which is probably why endings are so hard. You get so close to the material that there are things you don't see, so workshop it with CPs. I always save later versions of my books, not even first or second drafts, but the closer ones to publication where I'm more likely to have rewritten my ending, which I did on book 2 and book 3. I had to tweak it a few times. I save new eyes for the manuscript, non-editor eyes, and I give it to them, and I will ask them to read specifically bearing the ending in mind, that I want to know any questions that they have about the ending, any tonal shifts they notice, because if I've had an unintentional tonal shift, I need to know. Because another thing with endings I think that makes them so tricky, and maybe this is just me speaking from personal experience, I think it's such like a big thing to finish a book, and we're often so emotionally charged and we really want to finish a book. So I think the reason that endings can sometimes represent tonal shifts or feel very emotionally charged or skimp on information or what have you is because of the state of mind we are in when we are writing them. But on the other hand, revising fresh can be dangerous as well because you can go to your new ending forgetting stuff. So you want to workshop and ask your CPs about lingering questions. See what those questions are. Are they critical story and character questions? If so, you've left something out of your ending. Ask the different readers how they feel. How does the book kind of leave them? It's not a foolproof method because again, endings can be so subjective, but at least you'll know that you did your due diligence to workshop your ending as much as possible before putting it out in the world. At the end of the day, most endings are just fine. Some books have incredible endings, and yes, we'd all love to have that home run ending, but I'm personally happy if there's fine. But when you sit in fine, there's always going to be people who don't like it. So those are the basics of kind of what you want to find in an ending, some of the pitfalls of endings, and hopefully a practical tip to help you workshop your ending. I'd really love to know down below in the comments questions that you have or tips that you have for effective endings. I think this should be really kind of a discussion and conversational because there's no one uniformly right or wrong way to write an ending unless it's an abrupt ending in my personal opinion. And we're all kind of on a journey of figuring out how to do this stuff. Give this video a thumbs up if you like it. I will make more craft-based discussions, and if you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and happy writing.